I remember when playing behind my house was an endless exploration of imaginative adventures that could only further inspire my 8-year-old mind. Many times I was a barbarian warrior, like Conan, lopping off hands with my enchanted tree branch. The evil beasts conjured up in my mind stood no chance against my strength and wit, my lust for action and romantic adventure. However, I now realized just how close my world was to intertwining with the Sumerian, his fiction. For many years, the tales of sword and sorcery described monsters of unfathomable terror. Oh, such only brute force and unwavering mind of a fearless warrior could encounter and hope to defeat them. I was not this warrior, yet my discovery of a hidden terror seemed to be destined for me to find. For when I wandered off the set path which led from mine to my grandparents' house, I stumbled across a shaded patch of forest with a small, murky pond at its center. The area was dead quiet, save for the crunching of dead leaves beneath my feet and the occasional nerve-wracking pop of breaking twigs. I remember a slight fog over the water, more like a vapor dissipating, as if the pond was boiling. Yet, being an ignorant youth, I reached down and touched the surface and felt it was very cold, so much so that I drew my hand back in surprise, only to begin violently wiping my fingers on my clothes, for the liquid was like some sort of sticky alcohol. With the commotion I made, I heard across the water a soft rustling that seemed to be heading around the pond in my direction, but I stopped once I glanced towards it. For all my fear of the sound, my eyes suddenly came across a shape in the center of the pond. It was like a pale, smooth limestone, yet from it came a small, delicate trail of bubbles, escaping from an unseen pocket of air. Stupidly, I started to lean forward, squinting for a better look. I fell, my body submerging in the cold burning of the foggy liquid. I desperately tried to place my feet on whatever ground I could find, but there was none. I kicked and thrashed towards the surface, not wanting to open my eyes for fear of the liquid blinding me. Suddenly, I felt one of my feet strike something hard. The limestone, maybe? But in response, there came a sound, a low grunt of some kind. The pond began to build up a slight current, and, as if returning the favor, a sharp pain hit my thigh. I screamed into the mysterious water, and put all of my effort into reaching the shore of what now seemed to be an infinite ocean. I was no longer Conan as I breached the surface. I was a child crying out for his parents, smothering from the fumes of this potentially poisonous body of a creature-infested water. I climbed out after what seemed an eternity of an unwaking nightmare, and refused to look back as I ran from the pond. I expected to hear the sound of a monster breaching the pond's surface, but the silence of the dark woods remained unbroken. The vapors of the dry liquid trailed behind me as I desperately made for the familiar path. When it was in sight, I felt the calmness of familiarity which caused me to slow my pace. The world was luminous with the summer evening, and the creatures of common knowledge went about their business, ignorant of what I had found. When I reached home, I wondered if I had only dreamed up another fantastic story in which I had encountered the pond. There was no scent of the strange water, no more burning on my skin, but the fear in my heart returned as I looked down at my torn jeans and spied a coagulation of blood from a long scratch on my flesh. I hurried inside and tossed my clothes into the hamper, showering for good measure, unintentionally earning praise from my mother for being on top of my hygiene. I told my parents nothing about the pond or the scratch, but I couldn't completely hide my fearful glances to the window facing the edge of the forest during dinner. The question didn't come. All was normal within our house, which made me more and more at ease, as well as conscious of my illogical perception. The evening went on with my dad and I watching reruns of Star Trek, while my mom read one of her awful Amish-based novels in the lamplight. I look back on this time to comfort myself, given what was to follow. I was tucked into bed by my loving parents. Being an only child at the time, I was coddled quite a bit. The bedroom was alight with glow and dark stars, posters of Star Wars, shelves of action figures ready to defend me while I slumbered. The light of my aquarium and the shadow of the angelfish gliding on the wall eased me into a near doze, until the bubbles from the pump caused me to open my eyes in fear. Suddenly, as if responding to my fearful pondering, I heard a scratching in the vent near the right side of my bed. A soft clinking followed by breathing, as if something small was making a great effort to get through the grate. I was terrified. My hopes that my imagination from my playful excursions of the day had overtaken my senses were dashed. Yet, the delusion refused to let loose its prisoner, which was my sanity. I knew I had to face it to prove its non-existence, so that logic could once again have dominion. "Hello?" I asked of the darkness. Immediately, the noise ceased, and in my mind's eye, I could see a rat scurrying away in fear of its discovery. But it was my contribution to this fable that was dismissed instead. "You found it, boy," came the whisper of a tiny creature behind the grate. My eyes welled with tears at the sound. I was about to call out to my parents when it continued. "All this time I tried to keep it hidden from the short nose, and a runt such as yourself seems compelled to find it and wake it up." The voice was irritated, yet it also contained a fear in its reverence. "What was it?" I asked, in a trembling voice. My aquarium bubbled quietly, reminding me of the pale shape in the pond. "It is a manticore, one that has hibernated for many human lifetimes, but has ended far more. I was entrusted to watch over it by the one who placed it in the prison. You stirred it. Now it will soon awaken." As I rose up in bed, I forgot my fear of disturbing circumstances and speaking with hidden things. I knew what a manticore was. I knew it well enough to have it far from my mind to dream up during my woodland adventures, for the image of the creature caused real fear in me, though in a hypothetical sense. The image I had seen in books of monsters went through my brain and disturbed me anew. Now I realized that I had been scratched by the thing's relentless claws. Had I opened my eyes while submerged in the pond, I knew that I would have gone mad to see the shape within the burning fog. "What can I do?" I asked. It didn't respond, yet I could still hear it breathing in the vent. "Please, I didn't mean to wake it up," I whimpered. I was trembling beneath the bed sheets, which used to make me feel safe. Now I only felt cold and alone, guilty for bringing such a thing into this world. "You cannot put it back to sleep. It's been too long now, and it'll be hungry. You cannot hurt it with any weapon, for its flesh is invulnerable. It can eat you whole, and it'll leave no bones behind. Its roar is terrible, boy. Your mother, your father, will wake up to the sound of it, and will be taken by madness once it enters your home. It will devour your neighbors, all who dwell nearby, and no one will know what's happened to any of you." I fell out of my bed and onto the floor, sobbing. I crawled to the vent and put my face down to it, without fear of what might happen. "What can I do?" I implored. "How can I kill it?" In the grate, I could see a tiny shape stirring within, 2 glimmers of silver light peering at me, and I could see the green flesh of a long, pointed nose. It was a goblin, small and mischievous looking, though at the moment the eyes looked sad and pitying. When it spoke for the final time, I sensed the want of a brighter circumstance. "If you wish to truly be the hero you pretend to be, you must slay it through its mouth." The eyes disappeared, and a soft, scrabbling shape faded into the darkness. I was alone with this frightening knowledge, and I had to make a choice. Should I return to my bed and risk waking up to the roar of the manticore, or did I face it that very night, in the strange waters that it lay beneath? I was a child. I was scared, but I knew I couldn't let my family and my neighbors be devoured because of what I had done. I dressed, grabbed a flashlight and a small family picture propped up on the table next to my bed, then quietly went to the kitchen and grabbed the largest knife from the rack. With my weapon in hand, I went out the back door to the swaying trees of a windy midnight. I started up the path with an empty mind, neither allowing terrible imagery nor doubting logic to hinder my strides. I wasn't brave, but I wasn't foolish. I simply was. The reality, or at least my perception of it, had been shattered into shapeless pieces of mirror that, no matter how well formed, could never show my reflection in its former naivete. I prayed that I wouldn't find the pond, but I knew for sure that I would. The shape would be there. I would have to go back into the water, and somehow open the mouth of the manticore and shove my feeble knife into it. This was my plight. I was 8 years old, on an adventure in my favorite place to pretend, and I could feel a laughing mockery of my innocence when I left the path once more. There was no sound but the wind and the trees. A crescent moon in a star-filled sky watched me from afar. I held my family picture to my chest and watched the hills of dead leaves. The beam of my flashlight shone through the trees, who almost seemed lonely in this path. In true, this was a world left behind a long, long time ago, when fairies took flight and in the gardens of elves, dryads danced for satyrs piping tunes. Whatever creatures flourished in this pocket of time so close to my home were long since devoured by the manticore. Likely whatever force imprisoned the beast also sent it here to our plane, as well as having the courtesy of leaving a goblin behind to watch over it, no doubt. I finally saw the pond reflecting its murky grayness with my flashlight, and my soul cried out within me as a cold fear enveloped my body. There were no more vapors floating on the surface. Neither was there a pale shape below. It was still and empty. The thoughts now began to race, both logical and fantastical. It was gone. It was never there. I can return to my warm bed and forget about it. It will be there waiting for me in the midst of my parents' innards. I wanted to scream for all the emotions, but it was the manticore that screamed into the night, sending a terrible jolt through my body. My bowels cramped at the sight of the giant face of a human hovering 10 feet in the air. The paws of an enormous lion's body thudded to the ground, the wings on its back flapping a gust that almost made me topple over. The barbed, porcupine-like tail flicked violently left to right, taking out a tree with one careless swipe. The eyes were large and bulging, yellow with black gashes for feline pupils. When my eyes met that of the monster's, it screamed again in satisfaction at its discovery of its first meal after so long its slumber. I could see its 3 rows of teeth as it howled at me, and yet, somehow my only thought was, my parents are hearing this, and they're going to find out that I'm out of bed. They're going to look for me. They won't find me. I've been swallowed whole. When the manticore reached out to me, it stopped and gazed down at my tiny form and did something that finally snapped me out of my insane stupor. It grinned. The monster was grinning at my fear. The teeth were sharp and yellow. The stench of its breath broke through each of them and made me almost vomit. Stagnation of time, the willingness of its stomach acid to return to its labor. The manticore was ready to indulge itself. It breathed in through its nostrils, then opened its mouth and slowly came down over my head. Yet, somehow, instead of succumbing to terror, a white-hot hatred took over. I was offended at how weak it perceived me. I was irritated at how much of a bully this thing was. This freak of nature had thrown its weight around eons ago and eradicated the peaceful world in which I lived. I refused to let this happen again. Not to my family, my neighbors, and certainly not to me. I stepped on the first layer of its teeth and stabbed the knife into its tongue. It screamed and began to try to close its jaws on me, but I had already climbed further in and now sank my knife into the roof of its mouth. The beast thrashed its head, trying to sling me out, but I kept climbing further in, slicing and stabbing all the way through. I remember the barbarous man of action that I pretended to be, and I embraced it fully, burrowing deep into its throat, spitting blood from my own mouth as I climbed. By the sudden change in its equilibrium, I could tell it had fallen to the ground and was struggling against the pain. I pressed my feet against the back of its throat and shoved my knife deep into its skull. I couldn't penetrate it, so I began to cut upward as hard as I could. Its screams were deafening, but I knew that it could hear my laughter as I sliced and mangled without mercy. Suddenly, I was drowned in cold, burning water from the pond, along with fresh screaming as it mingled with the manticore's wounds. I lost my knife in the flood, but not my footing, or the family picture in my hand. I kissed it, then smashed the glass in the frame and shoved it into the open gash as hard as I could. The monster bellowed and suddenly began to whine pitifully. The thrashing ceased, and the water flowed inside until I was completely submerged. I began to swim out of the mouth, fearful of the teeth, but desperate to get out. My eyes burned horridly, and all the vision I had darkened from the night, so I felt my way past the teeth to the surface. Through the burning, I could make out the flashlight, which lay on the ground, and I swam towards it, fearing the claws of the beast seizing me and pulling me under. Suddenly there were small hands grabbing my arms and helping me out of the pond. It was the goblin, though I could barely see its shape. "You did it, boy! You did it! You slew the manticore!" I was confused. All the effort I put forth to hurt the creature still hadn't been enough to kill it. The goblin continued to bellow his claim, and I expected any moment that the thing would come back up and chomp us both. Yet the creature was silent. I could see now that it had plunged head first into the pond and drowned itself. It's really dead?" I asked. "Poisoned. The water is deadly to manticores that ingest it, which is why it was put here to sleep. But they can hold their breath for a long time. You made it drink the water to relieve the torture, and now its innards will burn away." I fell back and watched the star-filled sky. A meteor passed, and with it went my wish to always have this bravery that overcame my impossible fear. As the years progressed in my life, I found myself abandoning my imagination, my thoughts of heroism, but I always remembered the moment when I accepted my new reality at the edge of the pond. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. If you enjoyed tonight's story, why not go ahead and subscribe if you're not already subscribed. Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky stuff we do here. If you'd like to get a copy of my latest book, there's a link below. Or if you'd like to support the show more monetarily, you can always come down to Patreon. I have many tiers. I'm sure you'll find something that interests you. If you're interested in my books, I always recommend my Ghostly Reader tier. Ghostly Readers get a copy of my book signed on their doorstep anytime I write one, which is at least twice a year. Patrons always get their spooky a little bit early so they can enjoy them before that night's premiere. And speaking of patrons, let's go ahead and thank them. Thanks to Janet and Winters for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributors, and thanks to Xaronana, Emily Coltsfoot, Martha, Marianne Schuler, Jennifer Damron, and Tyler Parker for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks, guys. We just couldn't do the show without you. I'm sure by now you can see some videos appearing at the end here. If you think you might like a little more spooky, why not go ahead and click on another one? I'm sure you can handle a little bit more. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.